You will not believe what happened when Karen from the HOA decided to break into my lake cabin, and before I even begin, let me tell you this story is one you don't want to miss, so make sure you stay until the very end because what happened shocked the entire community and left even the police speechless. And if you enjoy real drama, where arrogant people get exactly what they deserve, then you better hit that subscribe button right now, because this is about to get intense. Now let me take you back to the start where it all began, because what happened that night in my lake cabin was nothing short of unbelievable. The air was calm and the sun was setting behind the water, casting orange reflections across the still surface. I had taken the trip out there to escape the chaos of the HOA for just a weekend. But little did I know the chaos was going to follow me directly to the doorstep of my own sanctuary. The cabin itself was secluded and quiet, surrounded by tall pines and a narrow gravel road that most people didn't even know existed. I had owned it for years, long before the HOA was ever formed in the nearby community. Yet somehow Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of everything she thought she could control, had decided that even my private retreat was under her jurisdiction. It all began with her constant nagging about how the cabin was an eyesore for the community, even though it was not part of her HOA territory. She claimed it set a bad example and brought down property values, which was ridiculous because the nearest HOA home was a good mile away across the lake, but logic never stood in the way of Karen's crusades. She thrived on confrontation and power. She needed someone to control, and since most of the neighbors had grown tired of her endless rules, I became her target. At first it was small things. Notes left on my truck windshield whenever I parked near the lake. Emails sent to my personal address about proper property management, even though she had no legal right. And eventually full-on confrontations where she would demand that I either fix my cabin or sell it. I ignored her most of the time. But things escalated when she found out I was meeting with someone at the cabin that weekend. And she jumped to conclusions, spreading rumors that I was running a legal business out of it. In reality, I was meeting with someone very important, someone who had been quietly working with me on exposing HOA corruption in the state. None other than the state attorney general himself, and we had chosen my cabin for privacy, away from prying eyes and ears. But of course Karen's radar for drama and power plays led her straight to my door. That evening, as I prepared the cabin, setting some files neatly on the table and making coffee, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. I looked through the window expecting to see the Attorney General's SUV, but instead, I saw Karen's white minivan parked crookedly in the driveway like she owned the place. My heart sank because I knew whatever was about to happen wouldn't be good. She slammed her door, marched up the steps without knocking, and with the audacity only Karen could possess. She pulled out what looked like a copied key and shoved it into the lock, but the lock didn't budge because I had replaced it years ago. Undeterred, she pounded on the door and shouted, "Open up! This property is subject to inspection under HOA rules, and you can't refuse compliance." I froze for a second, baffled at how far her delusion had gone. This was not HOA land. This was not her jurisdiction. And yet here she was demanding access like some sheriff. I shouted back that she had no authority. But she only grew louder, threatening fines, legal action, and even calling the police. I thought about ignoring her. But just as I was deciding whether to confront her, she suddenly threw her shoulder into the door, and to my shock, the flimsy frame gave way. Sending the door swinging wide open, I stood there, stunned, holding my coffee mug, as Karen barged in with a smug grin on her face, saying, "I knew you were hiding something here." And before I could answer, headlights washed over the cabin from outside. A black SUV pulled up, and the door opened, and out stepped the very man she should have feared most, the state attorney general, dressed sharp, carrying his own briefcase, and looking directly at Karen with an expression of sheer disbelief. I will never forget the silence in that moment as Karen's eyes darted from me to him and back again, her face slowly shifting from smug satisfaction to panic as she realized exactly who she had just broken in on. She stammered something about enforcing community standards, but the Attorney General raised a hand to stop her. His voice calm but carrying authority that filled the room as he said, "Ma'am, you just committed unlawful entry into private property, and you were about to explain yourself very carefully. Karen's jaw dropped. And for the first time since I had known her, she had no words. I could feel the tension crackle in the air, and I knew then that this night was going to unravel into something far bigger than either of us could have predicted. I was ready for every second of it because finally someone with real power was here to witness Karen's madness firsthand. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew heavy after Karen stormed out, her shrill voice still echoing faintly beyond the wooden walls as she stomped her way back toward the lakefront path, likely already scheming about her next move. For a brief moment, silence took over, broken only by the soft crackle of the fireplace and the faint rustle of wind outside brushing against the windows. I glanced over at Attorney General Robert, who seemed calm and collected, but I could tell from his sharp eyes that he was already processing what had just happened and calculating the implications. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and gave me a look that was part amusement, part warning. As though he was used to people like Karen barging into situations they had no business being in. Well, he said smoothly, that was interesting. How often does she make these little visits? I sighed, shaking my head. Too often. She and the HOA she practically runs have made it their mission to control every inch of this lakefront, even when it doesn't belong to them. They've harassed me, fined me for things they have no authority over. And now, apparently she feels entitled to barge into my cabin uninvited. Robert nodded slowly, his jaw tightening just a bit as he glanced toward the door, as though mentally preparing to deal with someone like her on a much larger scale. People like that get a taste of power, he said, and they convince themselves. They can do whatever they want. But what she doesn't realize is that she just trespassed into a state officials meeting. His words carried a weight that made me sit up straighter, realizing that Karen might have bitten off far more than she could chew. Before we could continue our discussion, I heard the crunch of footsteps outside on the gravel path again. My stomach sank, because I knew Karen wasn't going to let this go so easily. Sure enough, a few moments later, her screechy voice rang out again through the cabin walls, louder this time as though she had backup. "This is HOA property," she barked. "You can't just squat here without permission." "And who exactly? Is this man you're meeting? He looks suspicious to me." Robert's eyebrows arched, and he gave me a look that practically said, "Can you believe this woman?" He stood up this time, straightening his jacket and adjusting his tie with the kind of commanding presence that came naturally to him. "Shall we?" he asked calmly, motioning toward the door. I hesitated but followed him as he stepped outside onto the porch. Karen was standing there with two other HOA board members, both middle-aged men with smug expressions like they had been summoned to back her up in a neighborhood dispute. One of them held a clipboard as if paperwork was a weapon, and the other folded his arms, trying to look intimidating. Karen's eyes narrowed the moment Robert stepped out, and her tone dripped with self-righteousness. "And who are you?" she demanded, pointing at him. "I don't recall you being on the leaseholder list for this cabin. If you're not supposed to be here, then I'll have no choice but to call the sheriff myself." Robert didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even blink. He simply gave her a cool, professional smile and said, "Ma'am, I don't believe you understand who you're speaking to." His voice was calm, but had an edge of authority that made the two men behind Karen glance at each other nervously. But Karen, being Karen, pressed forward anyway, hands on her hips. "I don't care if you're the mayor or whoever you think. You are. You can't just barge into private property. This cabin falls under the HOA's jurisdiction, and I will decide who gets to use it." Her arrogance was breathtaking, even in the face of a man whose authority far exceeded her little neighborhood power games. Robert stepped down from the porch, his shoes crunching against the gravel as he closed the distance between himself and South End. Karen stopping just close enough that his presence was impossible to ignore. "My name," he said evenly, "is Robert Clarkson. I'm the Attorney General of this state. As of this moment, you're trespassing and you've interfered with a private meeting between myself and a citizen of this community." The effect was instantaneous. The smug expressions of the two men evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Their clipboards and crossed arms suddenly looked ridiculous in the presence of real authority. Karen, however, faltered only for a second. Before she laughed nervously, clearly trying to brush it off. "Oh, please," she scoffed, though her voice wavered, Anyone can say they're the Attorney General. That doesn't mean you are. And even if you were, you don't have the right to overrule HOA property rules. She stood firm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Robert pulled out his leather wallet and calmly flipped it open, revealing his official identification. The seal gleamed in the sunlight, and his name and title were unmistakable. The two men leaned forward, their faces blanching as they realized exactly who they were standing against. One of them muttered something under his breath and immediately took a step back. Distancing himself from Karen as though not wanting to be associated with her anymore, Karen, on the other hand, froze. Her face paled, then flushed red, then twisted into a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. Well, she stammered. I didn't know. You didn't exactly announce yourself, did you? Had known, I would have been more accommodating. Robert gave her a long, piercing look, the kind that stripped away every layer of pretense she tried to put on. Ignorance, he said firmly, is not an excuse for trespassing, harassment, or abuse of authority. You've overstepped? Mrs. What did you say your name was? Or Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. Karen? Karen Miller, she said quietly now, her tone a far cry from the shrill arrogance she had displayed earlier. Robert didn't say another word right away. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating, until Karen finally began to squirm. The Attorney General then glanced at me, and I could see in his eyes that he wasn't just protecting me. He was gathering evidence, witnessing firsthand the behavior of an HOA run amok. He turned back to Karen, his voice calm but filled with authority. Mrs. Miller, I strongly suggest you and your board reconsider how you conduct your operations here. From what I've already seen and heard, it seems you've taken liberties far beyond what the law allows. Karen tried to open her mouth to protest, but one of her own board members grabbed her elbow gently, whispering urgently in her ear. Caught just enough to hear him say, "Don't make it worse." She pulled her arm free, glaring at him, but the fear in her eyes betrayed that she knew her position was crumbling fast. The three of them backed away slowly, Karen throwing one last glare over her shoulder before muttering something about checking the bylaws, as if that would somehow save her. When they were gone, Robert exhaled, straightened his jacket again, and walked back inside the cabin. That, he said as he closed the door behind him, is a woman who has been allowed to abuse her power unchecked for far too long. And I don't like bullies. Okay. He sat back down at the table, his expression turning serious. Now, he continued, tell me everything she and her HOA have done here. Don't leave anything out. If they're violating state laws, they're going to have a very big problem on their hands. I leaned forward, finally feeling like the weight of months of harassment might actually lift. I began recounting the countless fines they had tried to issue me, the threatening letters, the intimidation tactics, and even the petty rules they invented just to make my life miserable. Robert listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, his face growing more and more stern as the list grew. By the time I finished, the cabin felt charged with a different kind of energy. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about accountability, about someone finally standing up to the toxic grip Karen and her HOA had on the community. Robert tapped his pen against his notepad thoughtfully, then looked me dead in the eyes. We're going to put an end to this, he said firmly. Not just for you, but for everyone they've been bullying. But it has to be done the right way, legally, so it sticks. They're not going to wriggle their way out of this with technicalities. His confidence was contagious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The tension in the air around the lake cabin had shifted dramatically from a petty HOA dispute to something that looked and felt more like a powder keg ready to blow. And the smallest spark could set everything off. Karen, who had walked into that cabin without permission and thrown her accusations around like confetti, had now realized far too late that her victim wasn't just a man renting out a place or even a wealthy landowner. Ignoring HOA, Ducey was sitting across from the state attorney general herself. If her face was pale before, it was chalk white now, though her mouth refused to close. Even in the face of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the state, she doubled down, stammering about rules, regulations, and bylaws, as if that mountain of legal nonsense could protect her. You can't just ignore the community. Covenants, she shouted, her voice cracking as her eyes darted between me and the Attorney General. This is HOA property, and we have jurisdiction here. The AttorneyGeneral.com and steady, slowly placed her coffee mug down every motion. Deliberate, her eyes drilling into Karen like a spotlight on a guilty performer. Jurisdiction, she repeated, her voice deceptively quiet but edged like steel. You broke into this home without cause or warrant. You've harassed this man repeatedly. Now you're trespassing. Do you really want to continue down this path, Karen? It's a question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Karen sputtered. But before she could form a coherent sentence, her backup arrived. 3 of her HOA cronies, men and women she had manipulated into believing her every paranoid word, pushed their way into the cabin without knocking, each wearing those self-styled HOA security jackets. They weren't police. They weren't deputies. They were neighbors, pretending to play cop, and they walked in like they owned the place. One of them barked, "Ma'am, this is official HOA business. We need you to vacate immediately," his eyes fixed on me with a practiced scowl. He didn't even look twice at the Attorney General, which was his fatal mistake. The AG calmly pulled out her identification badge, laying it flat on the table for them to see. The gold seal reflected the dim cabin light, and suddenly the air went still again. The so-called security officer's jaw fell open, his fake authority stripped away in an instant. Karen's voice shrilled again, cracking the silence.
Oh.
Don't let her intimidate you. This is our community. We set the rules. He's violating bylaws by bringing outsiders into HOA-controlled space. Her desperation was clear now. She was clinging to the only script she had ever known. The Attorney General rose from her chair slowly, not raising her voice, not threatening, but commanding absolute attention with presence alone. "Listen carefully," she said, her gaze sweeping across all of them. "This cabin is private property, legally registered and outside your HOA authority. You entered unlawfully. It makes this trespass, harassment, and potentially even breaking and entering. Do you want me to make that official?" The cronies shuffled, their false confidence crumbling. One of the women looked as though she might faint, whispering to the others that they should leave, that they'd gone too far. But Karen was not done. She stepped forward, pointing a finger at me, her anger shaking her entire body. "You've been undermining me from the start. This whole lake should belong to us. The HOA should decide what happens here. You're just trying to take control, and now you've dragged her into it to scare me?" Her delusion was showing. More than ever, I couldn't help but realize this was the core of Karen's personality. She didn't believe in compromise, didn't believe in fairness. She believed in power and control, and she thought yelling the loudest made her the one in charge. The Attorney General, however, wasn't moved by yelling. She leaned in slightly and, in that cool, sharp voice of hers, asked, "Karen, how many complaints have you filed against your neighbors this year?" Karen blinked. "That's irrelevant, 26, isn't it?" The ag pressed. "I've seen the records. 26 formal complaints in less than 12 months. Noise, fence, height, lawn color, dogs barking, and now trespassing into private property. You've turned your neighborhood into your personal battlefield, and it ends here." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The Attorney General didn't need to raise her voice. She had stripped away every excuse, every flimsy argument Karen might cling to. The cronies shifted nervously, no longer sure whose side they were even on. At that moment, headlights flashed outside the cabin. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet night, and then heavy boots crunched against gravel.
How real.
Law enforcement. 2 sheriff's deputies entered, their expressions puzzled until they spotted the AG. Their posture changed immediately. All seriousness, no hesitation. "Ma'am," one deputy said with a nod, acknowledging her authority. Karen turned toward them with wild hope, trying one last time to weaponize the law. "Officers, arrest him. He's violating HOA bylaws and refusing to comply with. That's enough." The Attorney General cut her off sharply, her hand raised in a final, undeniable command.
Deputies.
"You're looking at a case of trespassing, harassment, and attempted abuse of power by private citizens. I want reports filed immediately. Make sure the HOA board receives notice of a pending state investigation into misuse of authority." Karen's eyes went wide, finally realizing she hadn't just lost an argument. She had triggered something far bigger than she ever imagined. The deputies moved swiftly, separating her from her cronies, taking down names, writing statements. Karen kept shrieking about her rights, but no one listened anymore. Her own people looked at her with shame, muttering excuses to the deputies that they had been pressured into following her. The Attorney General sat back down, calm once again. Sipping her coffee like this was just another day at work. She looked at me and offered the faintest smile. "I told you," she said softly. "Sometimes the biggest bullies collapse the moment you shine a light on them." I nodded, though my heart was still pounding from the chaos that had just unfolded. Karen wasn't finished. Not truly, people like her never are. But the tide had shifted, and for the first time since this battle began, she was on defense. Outside, as the deputies escorted Karen and her crew back to their vehicles, her voice still rang out through the night, shrill and broken. "You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. You'll regret this." But the words no longer carried weight. The authority she thought she had was gone, shattered by a truth she couldn't outrun. The Attorney General turned back to me once more. "Stay steady," she advised. "This may be only the beginning, but now she knows she's not above the law, and neither does the rest of that HOA." The crackling fire in the hearth threw shadows across the walls, and I realized this fight wasn't just about me or my cabin anymore. It was about exposing corruption, about showing every neighbor who had been bullied by Karen that they weren't powerless. That night, as the deputies drove away with their reports, and the Attorney General made a few quiet phone calls, I sat in the cabin, knowing the battle had turned. The war, however, was still far from over. The morning after Karen's embarrassing attempt to disrupt my private meeting, the lake was quiet, the mist still curling across the surface, as if nothing had happened. Yet the echoes of that chaos hung in the air like a storm that hadn't quite blown itself out. And I knew the fallout was only just beginning because people like Karen didn't retreat gracefully. They doubled down when they felt humiliated. And humiliating her in front of the state attorney general wasn't something she would let slip away without an ugly fight. But what she didn't understand was that she had kicked open the door to a battle that was going to expose not just her personal grudges, but the very rotten foundation her HOA had been built on. And though I was tempted to lay low and let the Attorney General handle the legal side of things, I knew I couldn't simply fade into the background. Because Karen was a schemer and she'd be cooking up a narrative that twisted her intrusion into some ridiculous claim of self-righteous heroism, so I had to stay vigilant. Later that day, as I was walking along the lakeshore, I saw two of my neighbors, Peter and Diane, who had always kept their heads down during HOA disputes, waving me over nervously, and when I approached, they leaned in. Their voices hushed even though nobody else was nearby. And Peter said, "We heard about what happened yesterday." Word's spreading fast, but you need to know, Karen's been meeting secretly with a few board members. "Trying to spin this so you look like the aggressor," and Diane added, "She's telling people you staged it, that you brought the Attorney General here to intimidate her, that you're trying to ruin the HOA for your own gain." And though I almost laughed at the absurdity, I could see the fear in their eyes. The kind of fear that comes from living under the thumb of someone who thrives on intimidation. I realized they were trying to warn me because they'd seen what Karen was capable of when she turned her focus on someone. I thanked them, told them to be cautious, and as they walked away, I felt the weight of what this meant. Karen wasn't just embarrassed, she was weaponizing that embarrassment, and if she gained any traction with her lies, she might rally the entire neighborhood against me, and worse. She might even try to challenge the Attorney General's presence as illegitimate, though she was far out of her depth in thinking she could spin a government official into some kind of pawn in my supposed scheme. By the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Richard, the Attorney General himself, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of warning as he said, "She's already filed a complaint with my office, claiming harassment and intimidation, which is laughable given her behavior, but I want you to be aware of how far she's willing to go. Don't engage directly with her. Let us handle the legal side, but keep your eyes open. People like her are most dangerous when they realize the law isn't bending in their favor." And though his words reassured me, they also heightened my awareness, because Richard had seen plenty of figures like Karen in his career. And if he was telling me to stay cautious, it meant she was going to get desperate. Sure enough, the following evening, I returned to my cabin after running errands in town to find footprints in the damp earth leading right up to my back deck. The kind of heavy impressions that didn't match my boots, and though nothing was broken, I could tell someone had been there, nosing around. And it didn't take a detective to guess who it had been, because Karen's brand of vengeance always left fingerprints, literal or otherwise. I set up a camera system around the cabin that night, knowing she'd likely try again, and sure enough, just after midnight. The motion alert pinged on my phone, and when I pulled up the feed, I saw her figure creeping near the woodpile, a flashlight. Beams slicing through the darkness, as if she were looking for something incriminating to use against me. Though all she was really doing was documenting her own trespass. I saved the footage, forwarded it straight to Richard, and went back to bed with the strange comfort of knowing that every step Karen took now was digging her deeper into her own grave. But what I underestimated was her ability to weave those missteps into a story that could still convince the gullible, because by morning, a neighborhood email had gone out from the HOA board, drafted suspiciously in Karen's overdramatic style, claiming they were investigating serious threats posed by me and my guests at the cabin, suggesting that I was stockpiling documents to smear the HOA's reputation, and that Karen herself had been forced to investigate the property. Under her duty as board president, a laughable attempt to justify her midnight prowl as some noble act of neighborhood defense. When I read it, my first instinct was rage that she had the audacity to paint herself as a victim yet again. But Richard told me to stay patient, because every lie she sent out in writing was another nail in her coffin, and he assured me that the investigation his office was quietly conducting into HOA mismanagement would soon collide with her fantasy version of events in a way that exposed her once and for all. Still, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Whispers floating across yards and down the lakefront trails, some neighbors siding with Karen out of fear or ignorance, others cautiously nodding my way in silent support, and I felt like I was living in the middle of a Cold War that was about to ignite into something far louder and far messier. That weekend, the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the community lodge. One Karen insisted was mandatory, and though I hadn't planned to go, Richard urged me to attend. Not to defend myself, but to watch how she unraveled under the weight of her own lies. And so I walked into that room filled with tight faces. Karen sitting smugly at the head table, her stack of notes in front of her like some kind of courtroom exhibit. And when she stood to speak, she launched into a tirade so elaborate, so dripping with melodrama, that it bordered on parody, claiming I had turned my cabin into a hub for government spies, that Richard's presence was orchestrated intimidation, that I was scheming to buy up HOA land and flip it to developers, none of which had even a shred of truth. For a moment, I almost admired the sheer commitment to her lies. But then Richard, who had quietly entered the room and sat in the back without announcement, stood and introduced himself, his title alone sucking the oxygen out of Karen's performance. And in that moment, the smug mask cracked, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's as she realized her entire stage had been seized by the very man she was trying to frame as part of my plot. And though the room buzzed with whispers, Richard simply said, "This meeting is now under observation by my office," and the silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The following days were a whirlwind of shifting tensions as the fallout from Karen's reckless intrusion into the cabin continued to ripple through the community. And I realized just how deep the HOA's network of intimidation ran, for every time I drove into town, I caught suspicious glances, whispers, and even a few thinly veiled threats from neighbors who had once been cordial, but now seemed to take sides with Karen out of fear or loyalty to her influence. Though what they failed to realize was that the chain she had pulled on now had the weight of the state pressing against it, and the Attorney General was not one to be manipulated or cowed by neighborhood politics. Yet despite knowing that, the hostility grew thicker, almost suffocating, and my wife warned me that even stepping onto the dock felt like eyes were drilling into her back. The Attorney General had promised to handle the investigation through the proper channels, but he had also suggested that we keep our guard up, because people like Karen often grew desperate when cornered, and desperate people were dangerous. That prediction came true one rainy evening when headlights appeared at the far end of our cabin's dirt road. And within minutes, 3 SUVs rolled up, headlights cutting through the fog like weapons. Karen stepped out, not alone, but flanked by 2 men I had never seen before. Men who carried themselves like enforcers rather than neighbors. And the moment she started shouting about how she had rights to inspect properties on behalf of the HOA, I knew she was doubling down rather than retreating, trying to reassert dominance even after she had been exposed. My wife called the Attorney General immediately, but cell service was weak, and I stood between the cabin porch and the advancing group. My pulse quickening as Karen raised her voice loud enough for the whole lake to hear, demanding that we vacate her community's property or face forced removal. And when her henchmen started toward the porch steps, I knew things were reaching a dangerous boiling point. The Attorney General himself pulled up minutes later, lights flashing from his unmarked car, and his sudden appearance froze Karen in her tracks, her mouth hanging open as if she had seen a ghost. And in that instant, the men with her stepped back, clearly unwilling to cross the line when the highest legal authority in the state was standing before them. He didn't waste words. He simply pulled out a folder and handed it to Karen, explaining in a steady, commanding tone that she was now under investigation for criminal trespass, harassment, conspiracy, and potential fraud tied to HOA funds, and that any further attempt to harass us would result in immediate arrest. Watching her stammer and pale in front of the very person she had been railing against was a moment of grim satisfaction. But the Attorney General warned us quietly afterward that this wasn't the end, because people like Karen rarely backed down completely, and the process of dismantling her power would take time, evidence, and resilience. Over the next week, subpoenas began arriving at the HOA's office. Financial records were seized, and several board members resigned rather than be tied to Karen's spiraling downfall. But even as cracks spread through her empire, she still found ways to needle us, leaving notes on our dock, glaring through binoculars from across the water, and spreading rumors in town that the Attorney General and I were plotting to steal the lakefront community for profit. It became clear that this wasn't just about a personal vendetta anymore. Karen's pride and sense of ownership over the HOA's control had consumed her. Every step she took to claw it back only tightened the noose she had already slipped around her own neck. At night, sitting on the porch, I thought about how surreal it was that a simple lake cabin retreat had turned into a battlefield between everyday neighbors and the state's highest office, and how quickly people revealed their true colors when power was on the line. And though the Attorney General reassured me that the law would prevail, I also understood that the road ahead would test not only Karen's resolve, but ours as well. Because the line between neighborly disputes and outright criminal warfare had already been crossed. There was no going back to normal, not now, not ever. And with that realization came the sobering awareness that the showdown was only halfway through, and the most dangerous moves were still to come. As the evening settled over the lake, and the fading lights streaked the water with hues of gold and violet, the air around the cabin was thick with tension, though not in the way Karen had hoped when she first barged inside earlier that day, because now her smug self-assurance had all but drained away, leaving her pale and visibly shaken as the state attorney general's presence loomed over every word and action taken within those 4 walls, while neighbors whispered among themselves outside, piecing together what had happened and realizing just how deeply Karen had crossed a line that would carry consequences she could not control. And inside the cabin, I sat across from the Attorney General, still struck by how fate had turned such an ordinary Saturday into a defining moment in my battle against Karen and the HOA, and he listened carefully as I laid out, step by step, the harassment campaign that Karen had orchestrated over the past year. From her endless petty citations over the color of my shutters, to the threats she made when I refused to pay trumped-up HOA fines, and I recounted how she had repeatedly trespassed onto my property to snoop around, even snapping photos of my family when we were outside by the fire pit. And then today's shocking escalation when she used a spare key the HOA had acquired under questionable means to bust into my cabin uninvited, thinking she could intimidate me into some compliance without realizing she was not only interrupting a private meeting, but doing so in the presence of the state's top law enforcement official. and the Attorney General, who I now knew as Robert. Hayes nodded gravely at each detail, occasionally jotting notes into his leather-bound notebook, while interjecting with questions like, "Did you keep copies of the citations? And do you have dates and times of these trespasses?" To which I proudly handed over a thick folder I had been building, filled with evidence, photographs, recorded audio clips of Karen yelling threats, and even statements from sympathetic neighbors who had been burned by the HOA's abuse of power. And Hayes leafed through it, his eyebrows knitting tighter with every page, muttering under his breath, "This is not just overreach, this is criminal harassment." Meanwhile, Karen sat stiff in the corner, fuming but unable to speak out, because any attempt at protest was cut short by the Attorney General's steady gaze that reminded her she was out of her depth. And the sheriff's deputy standing at the doorway made it clear she wasn't leaving anytime soon without answering for her actions. And as the conversation continued, Hayes revealed something that stunned me even more than his presence itself. He had been investigating a string of HOA abuses across the state, from fraudulent fee collections to embezzlement and misuse of authority. And Karen's behavior that day had only accelerated his timeline, making my cabin ground zero for what could become a statewide crackdown on rogue homeowner associations. And hearing those words gave me a rush of vindication, because for so long I had felt like I was shouting into the void, trying to prove that Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands, but a dangerous bully who wielded power through fear and intimidation. And now, finally, someone with the authority to make it stop was taking me seriously. And Hayes explained that his office would be issuing subpoenas within the week, freezing HOA accounts until a full audit could be completed, and preparing charges that could include trespassing, illegal surveillance, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds if the evidence supported it. Which, judging by my thick file and the deputy's own reports, it clearly did. And Karen, hearing this, tried one last desperate attempt to reclaim control, standing abruptly with her voice trembling but still sharp as she cried out that this was her neighborhood, her association, and that everything she had done was for the good of the community. But Hayes shut her down cold, saying, "The good of the community is never served by violating the rights of its members." And with that, the deputies escorted her outside, where a group of neighbors who had gathered gasped as they saw Karen being placed into the back of a patrol car, not under arrest yet, but being taken in for questioning, a sight that spread like wildfire across phones and social media as photos and videos circulated within minutes, cementing the downfall of Karen's carefully cultivated image of control. And as the Attorney General prepared to leave, he clasped my hand firmly, telling me that I had done the right thing in documenting everything, that citizens standing up to corruption, no matter how small scale it appears, is what keeps communities free, and he promised to be in touch as the case developed. And when his car finally pulled away down the winding road, I sat back on my porch, the night air cooling against my skin, listening to the frogs croak by the shoreline, reflecting on how a day that began with dread had transformed into a turning point where truth and justice finally seemed within reach. And though I knew the battle wasn't fully over yet, as HOAs rarely went down without a fight, I felt an unshakable confidence that this time, with the state's highest law officer on my side, Karen and her empire of control were crumbling fast, leaving me, for the first time in months, able to breathe freely and believe that peace might actually return to the lakefront. The moment Karen realized what she had done was almost cinematic. It's a kind of raw shock that left her frozen in place as the full weight of her actions came crashing down around her. But by then it was far too late, because every authority that mattered in this state now knew that she had barged uninvited into a private residence, screamed accusations at the state attorney general, insulted his character, and even tried to block his exit like she owned the very ground he stood on. A scene so outrageous it became the talk of the entire county within hours, because the Attorney General's team did not just keep the matter quiet, they made a point of bringing it directly to the HOA board, city officials, and the media, explaining that if this kind of abuse of power from an HOA representative was allowed to go unchecked, then ordinary homeowners would never have peace, which meant Karen was suddenly painted as the symbol of HOA tyranny across every local headline and community forum. And while she tried to scream that she had been set up, neighbors who had quietly endured her harassment for years finally came forward in droves, telling their stories of how she had stalked them, fined them, trespassed on their property, and even threatened to have their children arrested for playing too loudly. And with each testimony piling up, the HOA board who once defended her leadership now turned on her completely, stripping her of her position, filing their own complaints with law enforcement, and scrambling to distance themselves from the mess, because no one wanted to be associated with the woman who thought it was wise to break into a lake cabin without. Realizing she was screaming at the state's top lawman, and when the case went public in court, the judge didn't even need convincing, because the evidence spoke for itself. Body cam footage from the deputies, testimony from the attorney general, sworn statements from neighbors, and even Karen's own HOA emails bragging about how she would teach that man by the lake. A lesson left no room for interpretation. And as the gavel fell, Karen's fate was sealed, convicted of trespassing, harassment, abuse of authority, and fined heavily enough that her own house faced foreclosure. A poetic ending considering how many families she had threatened with the same. While I stood back at the lake cabin, finally able to enjoy the peace I had fought so hard for, the Attorney General himself returning one last time to shake my hand, telling me that citizens like me were exactly why he stayed in office, because courage against abuse, even from a neighborhood bully, mattered more than anyone realized. And as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip across the water, I knew the fight was over. Karen's reign had ended. The lake was finally ours to enjoy without her shadow hovering nearby. So to everyone listening, let this story be a lesson and an inspiration. Never let a Karen or anyone drunk on power convince you that your rights don't matter, because when you stand firm, truth and justice will always expose them for what they are. So don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories for more real battles, real drama, and victories that prove no HOA Karen can ever outsmart the truth.